All right, well, with those propaedeutics in place, let me say a little something about the historical Buddha and his teachings. The historical Buddha was a man named Gautama Siddhartha. He lives traditionally from around the year 563 to around the year 483 BCE. We say around the year because scholars are debating the issue of exactly when he was born to this date. But traditionally, he's been thought to have lived around those times. And certainly the bulk of his work and his, for lack of a better word, mission was done during the 6th century BCE. So we can proceed more or less from that position. Anyway, the details of his life. Well, this is tricky because in a lot of ways, the Buddha is being a central figure within so many religious traditions, is someone who a lot of hagiography evolved around, a lot of religious stories and sort of saintly stories. But he is there's certain things that he testifies to himself as far as the way in which his life goes. Basically, we can see this. In his life, he was a prince, and he was, as a result of being a prince, exceptionally privileged. So much so that he never had to leave the palace. And as a result, he never knew the basic things that give rise to desire within us. He never knew want. He never knew hunger. He never knew fear. He never knew any of these things. He never knew death, right? Because when he was hungry, someone fed him. When he was tired, someone let him have a place to sleep. When he was bored, someone entertained him. All of these things, to such a degree that he didn't know what it was to want. He didn't understand the nature of suffering, because the moment that which gave rise to suffering appeared in him, it was quenched immediately by some servant, by someone who was attending to him, as though this were a way to escape the problem of suffering. But this also left him incredibly naive. And as a result, when he finally left the palace at the age of 29, he saw some things that really just struck him down in a way that he had never, ever anticipated. He saw a poor, suffering old man. He saw a sick man. He saw an afflicted man, and he saw a dead man. And seeing all of these things, he's overcome with a sense of despair. He's overcome with the sense that these things should not and ought not to happen to another human being, that these are afflictions that seem to be almost a perversion of what it is to be a person, right? And he asks the person attending to him, the charioteer who's with him, are these things going to happen to me? Will I have this thing of getting sick? Will I have this thing of getting old? Will I have this thing of suffering? Will I have this thing of dying happen to me? And he says, yeah, actually all these things will happen to you. It's inevitable. Well, this fills Gautama Siddhartha with an enormous sense of sadness and despair for a moment. And then, being the great spirit that he is, he rises up and makes a decision, indeed a vow, that he will conquer these things within this lifetime. And so, in the tradition that he is a part of, because remember, he's living in northeast India, in Nepal, so he's part of at the time, he's part of the Brahmanical tradition. He does what anyone who makes such a vow would do within that tradition. He becomes a sadhu, a hermit, a mendicant who goes out and renounces everything in search of liberation, of moksha, right? And so he renounces his title as prince, he renounces his family, he renounces all his worldly goods, he renounces everything, and he goes off naked, literally naked, into the forest to find enlightenment. Now, he goes there, he encounters a few other sadhus who he studies and meditates and practices with, and he spends 6 years in very intense pursuit of enlightenment. And after 6 years of study and of practicing these austerities, he discovers that he is hungry and naked and cold and lonely and no closer to enlightenment. And he's filled with a deep, deep sense of despair, and he's just about to give all of it up. And then, as fate would have it, or as the world would have it, he happens to be sitting on the bank of a river, and out on the river there is a music lesson going on. They do music lessons on these boats because of the acoustics on the river. And he hears the music teacher giving the student a lesson. And he hears the teacher say that the following. He says, "You must remember that you cannot string the instrument too tight, and you cannot string the instrument too loose, because if you do, it will not make a sound." Now, to you and to me, this might just sound like a little bit of practical advice with regard to stringed instruments. But to Gautama Siddhartha, this was more than that. This was a metaphor. This was an allegory. This was a doorway. This was an insight, or at least a possibility of insight. And so that he reflects upon this, he goes, returns to the forest, meditates the entire night upon this idea. One must not string it too tight. One must not string it too loose, or there will be no sound. And from this, he arrives at the idea of the middle way. The middle way. And this idea of the middle way forms the basis for the Four Noble Truths, the core of Buddhist teaching, which I will get to shortly.